Ken Cearley, who is the Extension Wildlife Specialist for far west Texas, the Panhandle, and the South Plains. And he's going to be talking about wildlife nutrition, food plots, and other supplemental feed. So, Ken, if you want to, go ahead and jump in here and we'll get you started.
Okay, thank you, Jared. Well, we have a lot to talk about in the next 30 minutes. We thought we'd begin this deal with a subject that had been brought up by many of the county agents as a subject of interest concerning wildlife, and that is wildlife nutrition. I took a little license and decided to spend time talking about food plots and other supplemental feed and whether or not they're viable strategies for deer and quail management, because I feel like that's probably where most people are coming from when they're questioning or asking questions about wildlife nutrition. So that's the tack we're going to take in the next few minutes. Just to set the stage, let's talk about deer first. We've got about 150 to 250,000 mule deer in the state. Their populations vary quite a bit by precipitation. I have a note there that they're precipitation dependent. Of course, so are whitetails. They have to have rainfall in order to grow the food they need. But mule deer are especially tuned in to precipitation, and their populations fluctuate quite a bit based on how much precipitation they get. Most of the mule deer in Texas are in the Trans-Pecos, and you'll see some declines from land fragmentation and habitat loss, and habitat speaks to this nutrition subject that we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. Whitetails, we've got about 4 million of them in the state. They're under-harvested in some areas, leading to crop depredation. You see that also under depredation in suburbs and around the urban-rural interface. Deer management really involves some basic things such as population, knowing what you have. People, we've got to have people for the harvest, people to just enjoy the deer from all different aspects, sometimes just to observe. And then habitat. Again, that's where nutrition comes in. We'll talk about nutrition as being one of the cornerstones, one of the three legs of the stool, if you might say, or the triangle in deer management. Those three are age, genetics, and then nutrition. Very important part of deer management. I like to recommend that people use sort of a blueprint when they start managing their deer herd. Before you start, you need to know what those deer require by way of food, and know how many you have, and know your assets, and then know your objectives. Plan your approach. Use that plan. That's a very important thing. Don't just put it on the shelf. And then be committed long term. Many of these management steps take a long-term commitment. So you'd have a basic strategy first of determining what those goals and objectives are. Are you looking for quality deer, or maybe quantity is the big deal? You can't always have both. What's your clientele desires or your own personal desires? What level of management intensity are you willing to get into? In this case, how much supplemental feeding, or if any, would you want to get into? How much capital is available? Are you risk averse, or are you willing to take some risks? And the second thing, as far as a basic management strategy is concerned, in my opinion, is to manage the range resource to provide abundant, high-quality deer forage. Be it hackberry, skunkbush, sumac as a food source, ephedra, bush sunflower. Many, many plants could be depended upon. Mountain mahogany in the Panhandle and other parts of the state. The northern parts of the state is an important deer food. Managing your country to provide that high-quality deer forage is challenging, and I think the most interesting part of deer management. What would be the single greatest impact on forage abundance and availability? Here we're talking about forage and how to have enough of it. Short of rainfall, which of course you have to have, I would say stocking rate of deer and livestock. Not one or the other, but both. If livestock are in the picture, in many places they are. And we see that overgrazing can take place pretty easily, and there begins to be a degree of competition between deer and livestock. Not always competition. Sometimes they'll coexist just fine. But let's look at the typical diet of of a white-tailed deer, for example. Mostly browse. A lot of us know that. The tender leaves off of shrubs and low-hanging trees, woody plants, in other words. A good bit of forbs and some grass, but notice not much grass. Cattle, mostly grass eaters. No surprise there. They do eat some browse, they do eat some forbs. Sheep, about half of their diet is grass. Quarter browse, quarter forbs. These are just generalized diets of some of the common wildlife and livestock. Goats, mostly browse eaters, as you can see here. So they probably have the most potential for competing with white-tailed deer. Competition really takes place when there's a limited resource and you start running out of it. If there's plenty of food to go around, it's sort of like an all-you-can-eat buffet where there's plenty for everybody. That's not competition. There may just be some overlap in the diet. If we look at those diets and place it on this sort of a graphic affair, you see cattle are mostly grass eaters. We see that whitetails are mostly browse eaters. You probably wonder where I'm going with this. Mule deer, a little more forbs, but still mostly browse eaters. You can imagine that this is a situation that you can tolerate, that is just fine. You've got little overlap, very little overlap in diet, probably minimal competition. The competition may come in if the cattle run out of grass. They can easily move over to eating forbs and browse. However, deer and mule deer and whitetails cannot move over and eat grass when grass is in abundance. So we see that cattle, for example, certainly could compete under some situations with deer for forbs and browse, impacting their nutritional plane, no doubt. What's the second greatest impact on deer forage abundance and availability? Well, I would argue it might be grazing system, because it can have so much impact on how much forage is out there. Stocking rate is more important probably than this grazing system, but the second thing might be how do you move those livestock around and achieve the kind of plant community that would be desirable for livestock and for deer. We won't go into these in great detail right now, but we'll just throw it out there as food for thought, that you might want to consider your grazing system as well as the grazing intensity as it impacts your deer. I mentioned population being important. Certainly the number of deer you have has an impact on how much food is out there, and many people use various kinds of census methods to get a herd inventory. It's important to realize, again, just as setting the stage here, that they're probably only 40 to 70% accurate, some a little more accurate than others. It usually underestimates deer numbers, so they're best viewed as trend information, and you may adjust your numbers. For example, when I'm doing aerial count, I'll do a couple at least and see if they jive with each other, and if they're both fairly close to each other, then I'll double the number of deer for my inventory, which is a concession to this idea that the accuracy generally is off by that much. So what? Well, you know how many deer you got. What are your harvest goals? You need to maintain your numbers, modify your numbers. You need to know how they should be removed in order to keep the numbers down to what the place can support. Supplemental feed is one of the current trends nowadays that people are really not just considering but getting into, and you would think it's essential for good deer management based on how many people get into it, along with high fencing and food plots, brush sculpting, and even predator management. But let's talk about supplemental feeding for a little bit, and talk about some extensive means. I guess there's a couple of ways to read that sentence. We're talking about extensive means to supplement forage as opposed to intensive means. One of them is fall and winter disking. You might do that around the edges of fields and brush mottes. It increases forb production, like you can see in this photograph here. This is a road. You can barely see the ruts right there. The disking was actually done on this side over here, and you can see an abundance of sunflowers that have come up on their own. And you may have more or less sunflowers in your area. There may be some other species that comes up instead, but you'll be surprised at the seed bank that's there and will manifest itself with some soil disturbance like a disking. Good practice to supplement the forage for your deer. If you want to plant some locally adapted trees or shrubs, you can do that. You can provide cover and food by doing that. Some parts of the state have all the shrubs they can stand, and they want to reduce their brush density, and other parts of the state people want more. Texas Forest Service has what they call package, which are combinations of bare root trees and shrubs that you can use for various parts of the state that are chosen for their applicability to deer management or quail management. And that nursery now is in Lubbock, of all places, where there's so few trees, but that's where the nursery is, and you can order them online if you like. It's Texas Forest Service online seedling store. Use the best farming practices, planting those seedlings as you would if it was a crop. Otherwise, because if you don't irrigate them and have good weed control, you'll be wasting your time. So use the best farming practices there. And we don't really recommend them for prairie restoration efforts. After all, prairie is devoid to some extent, maybe completely devoid in other cases of feed plants or trees at least. And that may be the best situation for prairie restoration. So consider that fact when you're thinking about putting in trees on your country. Prescribed fire is another extensive means, as opposed to intensive, again, to supplement forage. Very good tool for forage enhancement. Now, food plots, we're finally getting to that subject. Are they required for genuine deer management? As I intimated a while ago, you would think they were, because so many people automatically engage in that kind of effort when they start a deer management program. Well, they might be a valid part of the picture in your situation, but as we often say, when you need them, you probably can't grow them because of drought, and when you can grow them, you probably don't need them because of a paucity or abundance of rainfall. And as you can see here, there's a wide variation in rainfall from over 50 inches in East Texas to less than 8 inches in West Texas, and probably somewhere along the middle of the state, about the eastern side of the Panhandle and on down, is the line to the west of which you may want to really think twice about food plots. I'm not saying they absolutely won't work there, dryland farming, but it sure will be more of a challenge for you if you're in that part of the world. Much like planting those trees, be sure to use the best farming practices. Get a soil test, fertilize if that test recommends it. Make sure you have some means of weed control as you establish it. Use known adapted species, and then protect from grazing, like we see with this high-intensity, high-voltage fence here that we've got protecting this crop. And then, of course, pray for rain, because if all else is in good shape and you still don't get the rain, you're not going to be in good shape food plot-wise. It's amazing to me, maybe it is to some of y'all, how common plants really are the best plants for food plots. It doesn't have to be anything exotic. Beans, peas, grains, and that includes the dryland grain sorghum or milo, are some of the best choices for summer food plots. Winter food plots are things like oats and wheat, the small grains that you're used to planting for livestock. They also are good producers for a wildlife food plot.
Hey, Ken, can I jump in there real quick for 1 sec? Sorry.
Sure.
Hey, Brian, can I get you to mute your microphone? Sorry, all the offices, I didn't say this earlier, if y'all can, mute your microphones because we're getting some feedback until you're ready to actually start asking questions, which we'll hold that until at the end of everybody's presentation. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. Ken, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Generally, this is just a ballpark rule of thumb, but generally a 1/2 to 5 acre in size is a good idea. Make them long and narrow. That's better than something square, because you end up with more edge. That is that area between the food plot and the adjacent habitat. Those are valuable areas. Shoot for maybe 2 to 5% of your ranch total acreage, and try 1/2 of the plot in cool season, 1/2 in warm season species, and adjacent to escape cover, as I mentioned. Some of those cool season annuals that I mentioned a few of them a while ago, but in addition to wheat and oats, you also have rye and triticale, even turnips. Turnips are easy to grow. It's going to be difficult to keep the deer off of them while they're growing. You'll have to have a fence around them for sure. Vetch, winter peas, clovers, depending on how much rainfall you have. Some of the perennial food plots for deer are really good ideas because you don't have to cultivate them every year. Alfalfa is one, bush sunflower, and in the east, clover can actually be a perennial food plot. Engelmann daisy, Illinois bundleflower, and in the western part of the state, four-winged saltbush makes a good plant to use for a perennial food plot. So is supplemental feeding the answer to your lack of deer forage? It might be. It does increase food, not carrying capacity. You still have that limitation on how many animals you can have out there. And I'd probably say this more than once, but maximize the potential for the range resource first, and then through proper habitat management. At least that's what I would recommend before you go into a supplemental feeding program. Supplemental feeding really is not baiting. We might do that with corn during the hunting season, but that's not what we're talking about. It's often not year-round, and it's not a complete feed. It just supplements the forage that's out there. And maybe most important, it's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. It may be part of your overall picture, but it won't be the whole picture. It's not hard to justify a feeding program. You can realize the genetic potential of the deer, just like you would a growing heifers in your cow herd. You feed them as well as you can so they can realize their genetic potential. It improves the viewability, of course, of deer, because you might be able to see them by virtue of that feeder being there and them coming to visit it. It can help you achieve your harvest goals. It serves a marketing. You can enhance marketing and maybe just your enjoyment and the fact that you have better bragging rights because of the size of your deer herd. There's some advantages to supplemental feeding. Some that I haven't mentioned already, I guess. You can reach trophy class at an earlier age. You have a lower post-strut mortality because of better nutritional status. It allows genetically superior animals to reach their potential. You could carry more quality animals in a given area. More quality animals, not more animals. Smooth out the boom and bust population in the cycles, and you could expand the range or hold animals in an area if other factors are not limiting. And something I didn't mention, but it's pretty important, you can shorten the period of time that the does conceive. In other words, your fawning period will be shortened, and that allows you to customize your feeding to a certain level for that period of time when deer have the greatest lactation and the greatest nutritional needs when you have a shorter fawning season. There are some disadvantages. It takes a long-term commitment, and it's a learned behavior that deer will have to get accustomed to. It might take 3 years response time. More intensive management is required for harvesting, for marketing, even, of course, for the feeding program itself. There's the cost, feed and equipment and labor, of course, and it's inherently inefficient. You're going to be feeding some non-target animals. Try as you might to keep critters out of there, and in this case, they didn't try very hard. They practically made it easy for the non-target animals to get to it. There are other folks that have put wire around the cages to find that the critters are smarter than they thought, and they still get in there, or wire around the feeders. And some others have gotten pretty tricky with trying to catch those non-target animals as they get to the feeder instead of keeping the feed away from them. But maybe one of the best ways is to have a selective kind of feeder, one that's most likely to be used by the deer and not something else. And some of these types of feeders accomplish that pretty well. Okay, now some of the nuts and bolts of their nutrient requirements, and we won't get real deep into it, but adequately, I think, for management of your deer herd. Deer need water, protein, they need carbohydrates, lipids, vitamins, minerals. Well, what's missing there? We hear people talking about energy all the time. Well, they need that, but it's found in protein, it's found in fats, and it's found in carbohydrates. It's found in more than one place. And it's the most variable, also from the food source itself, and also their needs are most variable through the year for energy. Deer are a ruminant animal like a cow. They have 4 stomachs, or 4-chambered stomachs, some would prefer to say. The rumen, omasum, abomasum, and reticulum. The rumen is the largest part of the digestive system, and it's where the food goes first. It's interesting and important to note that the rumen has microbes in it, bacteria, that digest the food. that begin that digestive process. And what we're really doing is feeding that rumen, or at least part of our feeding program has to include feeding the rumen itself, the rumen bugs, so that they can do a good job of digesting. So it's a pretty complicated thing when you get down to designing a feed. You'll want to use a feed supplier that understands the rumen and the needs of deer when you purchase feed. Deer need 6 to 7% crude protein for that rumen to function properly, 13 to 16% for adequate growth and antler production, reproduction. And if there's excess, it'll be excreted in the urine. I guess it's better to have feed to excess than to have a lack of protein. They'll just overflow, you might say, in a simple way of putting it. But buy on the basis of quality and cost per unit of protein. And that'll be your best way of judging one feed with the other if all other things are equal. A mineral package can be placed in that feed, which is a good means of getting mineral into deer. They're pretty reticent, it seems, to lick a mineral block, but you can get that added mineral into their system by virtue of the feed if you use feed. Ecological considerations, we talked about non-target use. What about congregation? Well, there is some degree of potential for disease spread because they're congregated so much. It facilitates luxury feeding. They get enough feed at that feeder to be able to more lackadaisically or I don't know, easily go about looking for the preferred plants in the habitat. And some of those preferred plants may decrease in abundance while lesser species become more abundant because of them concentrating on those preferred plants and having the time and the energy to do that because of all that supplemental feed they got. There's a reproductive impact on the target and the non-target species. Think about how much better these coons are going to reproduce thanks to the feed that they unintentionally got. Deer could be fed protein pellets, alfalfa, whole cottonseed meal, soybeans, cowpeas, other things, and accomplish their needs. But again, it's inherently inefficient. What about cottonseed? Well, many people are afraid to use cottonseed because of gossypol, and it's a good reason to be a little leery of that toxin that cottonseed has in it. It does have some reproductive effects. Well, how much of an effect is it that we need to worry about? Dr. Randall in Overton did some work on fallow deer and found out with access to Bermuda grass and free choice of whole cottonseed, it retarded their antler growth about 50%. It lessened their body condition score, and it lowered testosterone levels in males about 50%. That's a good reason not to feed whole cottonseed, isn't it? Well, let's not make that judgment just yet. He had another study in 2003. He looked at fallow bucks and does, again, access to Bermuda grass, and fallow bucks and does will eat much more grass than white-tailed deer do, and so it worked out for that to be the basis of their feed. And on several levels of cottonseed meal, not whole cottonseed, fed daily, he found no significant difference between the groups. Body condition scores remained good, and all females bred, which tells you, of course, that the males must have been fertile enough to get them bred. Cottonseed meal, I need to make a note, though, that it's generally about 1/10 the level of gossypol compared to whole cottonseed. And that test with whole cottonseed was looking at a situation where it was free choice and in a pen situation, sort of the worst or the extreme situation when it would come to whole cottonseed consumption. Is it a good deer feed? Well, just based on that first study, you might say, heck no, I wouldn't want to use it. Well, it's been used successfully in feeding bulls for over 100 years, if excess is avoided. The bottom line is it's an excellent feed if it's fed at less than 0.5% of the body weight per day. It's about 20% protein, high level of phosphorus, high level of fat. The hull encapsulates it and protects the ingredients against weathering and so forth. And it's relatively low cost. The last couple of years, 3 years or so, it hasn't been near as cheap as before, but it's still relatively low cost. But again, the caveats are feed it at less than 0.5% of the body weight per day or less. Use caution when they're in a confinement situation. And in the range situation, it doesn't appear to have ill effects. And be careful when forage availability is limited. Even in a range situation, it might have ill effects because there's so little other forage to eat. And then think about where you're going to place your feeders. I would recommend they be placed so that an animal would never be more than half a mile from any location. You may get by with more than that. Your goal may be less than that, but that's a good rule of thumb, I think. And then space them to minimize voids, like we see here, where animals would have to go farther than that to get to a feeder. The easier it is to get to the feeder, the better. So the bottom line is, if you can afford it, go ahead, but measure the results. Please be sure and do that so you can gauge whether it's effective or not. And what about quail habitat? Does it provide all the food that quail need? Well, I've answered that question here. Food has not been found to be a limiting factor for quail populations. If there's habitat there for quail to exist otherwise, generally those same plants that provide the protective habitat also provide the food that they need. That doesn't mean you wouldn't want to supplementally feed them. Some people do. We'll talk about that for a few minutes here. Quail have a crop where they store food much like the rumen, except there's not much digestion that goes on there. It passes down through the proventriculus to the gizzard, where the grinding of those seeds takes place, and the real digestion begins with smaller particles. Up here in the crop, you will have whole seeds sitting there. I mention that because it has a bearing on our understanding, I think, of what kind of plants that are important to them. They'll eat some greens, but many times it's seeds from grasses, browse, and forbs. They need about 28% protein the first few weeks of their life, and that's usually accomplished mostly with insects. As they grow older, they need lesser and lesser amounts of protein, and then a bump up to maybe 20% when they're breeding birds. Some of the key species, grass seed species, are shown here, and you can imagine these seeds being taken into the crop and then passed on to the gizzard to be ground up. The harder the seed, the better it weathers, and the larger it is, the fewer times the bird has to peck the ground to pick one up. That may have some bearing on your managing your country for particular species of plants, but as I said, food is generally not limited for quail. Here's some key woody plant seeds for quail diets: algerita, acorns, catclaw acacia, catclaw mimosa. You can see, judged by this ruler that's below them, that some of these are pretty large, like chittenden wood, hackberry, and so forth. Here's one from lopebush. Forbs provide, or weeds provide some seeds for wildlife, or for quail as well. Astragalus, common broomweed, a tiny little seed, but very important part of their diet in some situations. Buffalo burr, you can see these others. Bull nettle, a large seed that's a good one to be managing for. Not managing for necessarily. You don't want a bunch of buffalo burr on your place, but you can rest a little easier knowing that if they are there, that the quail are going to be able to utilize some of those seeds. Food plots for quail, again, if you're in an area with less than 20 inches of rainfall per year, it's going to be tough unless it's irrigated. Be sure and measure the results. Use the best farming practices like we mentioned before, including fencing, so you can determine when animals other than quail can get in there, if it's a dual purpose kind of a food plot. And you might have a third of it for quail and the inner third for deer. You sure want that fencing around it so that the plants could get established before you turn any deer in there. Here's some examples of food plots and also hunting areas that were put into place here in the Panhandle. Some of them small grains, or winter small grains, and some of them warm season grasses, plants. But it gives you an idea of the kind of situation and even the diversity of plants and placement that you might use on your plate. Supplemental feeding is especially useful, or maybe primarily useful during stressful periods like extreme drought, ice, or snow. And if nothing else, it's a starting place for hunting. It's generally a neutral practice. Measure the results so that you'll know whether or not it's worth doing long term. I mentioned earlier that food's not a limiting factor, except if everything's covered up in ice or snow for more than 3 or 4 days, the birds are going to have a hard time getting by because they can't. Their fat deposits will only last that long. So if nothing else, those bird feeders, those quail feeders will really come in handy in times like this when you have their food supply covered up. Other species get in there and eat the feed from those quail feeders. We know that raccoons and turkeys and non-game birds and a variety of others use the feed. We can see through the year here that quail are nevertheless enjoyed the share of it that they wanted. A study was done a while back that showed that when ground cover is short on a transect with artificial nest placement on it away from, in both directions, in opposite directions away from a feeder, we see that when ground cover was short, there was poor nest survival in those artificial nests. When ground cover was adequate, the presence of the feeder lessened nest survival. In other words, the closer to the feeder, the greater the predation. So that's a thing to keep in mind when it comes to feeders. There may be more predation around those feeders. The Packsaddle quail study in Oklahoma, looking at two different 1,200-acre areas, one fed and one unfed, they used milo, found that quail feeders did not increase bobwhite survival. Quail feeders did not increase bobwhite population numbers, but avian predation was higher on the supplementally fed area. The game bird production has not always been shown to be enhanced by removal of those predators, although that's something you'd be thinking about doing when you realize that that was one of the results of their study. There may be some overriding variables that would thwart isolating that single management tool, that is predator management, and your ability to expect it to be significantly effective. There may be a host of variables that are actually at play and not just that single thing, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about real quickly recommendations regarding food plots for deer or quail and supplemental feeding. I've been harping on this. I'll say it one more time. Keep records to be able to price the hunting appropriately, to recoup the cost of the feeding program. Attempt to isolate the effect of the feeding so that its impact can be evaluated objectively. In other words, if possible, don't change a whole lot of things all at once about your management program. Just add this management tool, supplemental feeding, and see what impact it has. Be prepared to increase the harvest rate in the case of deer, because you'll have a greater reproduction, we hope, than you would expect. Consider this the overall objective. First, produce the best deer you can, the most quail possible through proper grazing management, proper stocking rate, adequate harvest, proper age structure. Then consider a supplemental feeding program. That would be my recommendation. In this overall strategy, first manage for the best habitat you can provide. Then, if you're so inclined, pursue that supplemental feed. Always monitor, measure, record, and analyze the results. And then adjust the strategy as needed. Don't figure that you have to stick with whatever you started doing at first with no changes. So I think I'm just about out of time. That's all I have to present at this time.